Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all. Welcome to the NASEO Distribution Planning Training for State and Territory Energy Offices. I'm very excited to see you all and have you join today. Some of you might know or have attended the transmission planning training that we did in November. And this will be fairly similar with some presentations from experts as well as from states, but we'll go over the agenda in a minute. Before we start, I wanted to do a couple of sort of framing remarks as well as go over housekeeping items and then the agenda. And then we have a very short kind of quiz to just give our presenters, or not quiz, it's more a poll, to give our presenters an idea of who is in the room and what your level of familiarity is with the with distribution planning. And before we get started, just a huge shout out to not just all of you for attending, our presenters, but also the Department of Energy for supporting this training. So distribution planning plays a crucial role in achieving state energy goals, and it's really a core element and requirement of the state energy program, just like transmission planning. And that's why NASEO has sort of set up these two training on distribution planning and transmission planning. If you missed the transmission planning one, we will put a link in the chat. We record these, at least the presentations, and then we share that on our website for people who can't attend or for you to reference. And as you all in the states confront growing electricity demand, aging infrastructure, and evolving grid resilience needs, really effective engagement from the state side in distribution planning is more important than ever. And so we're hoping that this training will strengthen your technical foundation while connecting you with other state energy officers and experts on these issues. And our intent is that you gain a strong understanding of distribution fundamentals, so both a great refresher for experienced staff as well as for new people, to gain practical insights from other state energy offices that have successfully engaged in distribution planning processes, and give you some actionable ideas to enhance your state energy office's participation in distribution planning and engagement with utilities on these issues. So on the housekeeping side, as I mentioned, we'll be recording just the presentation portions, so you'll have an opportunity to ask questions later on, which we won't be recording. If you have any kind of question, please feel free to put that in the chat. We'll also have an opportunity later on for you to raise your hand and we can take your question live. If you are not speaking, we just ask you that you please put your microphones on mute. This is a meeting, so you can unmute yourself, but please only unmute yourself if you're asking a question. And I already mentioned that we will have time for Q&A, so please just put your questions in the chat or raise your hands later on. A brief overview of what we're covering today. We'll have initial presentation from Lisa Schwartz and Natalie Mims-Frick from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory on distribution planning fundamentals. We'll then have a session on how to engage with utilities and industry partners and hear from ICF and the Smart Electric Power Alliance. Then we will have a short 15-minute break for you all to stretch and get up and get a cup of coffee or tea. And then we have a great panel on to hear from some of the states, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Rhode Island, on how they are engaging on distribution planning. And then we have a final session where ICF as well as NASEO will talk a little bit about resources and tools, and we'll wrap it up promptly at 5 p.m. Eastern or a little bit earlier. So we did want to kind of see who was in the room, and so we have a very, very short questionnaire that Camille will launch that you should see on your screen right now. So the first question is just how familiar are you with distribution planning in your state? Are you not familiar at all, somewhat familiar, moderately familiar, very familiar, or you're an expert? And then just if you want to answer after the completion of this training, I would like to understand better what is it that in distribution planning you would like to hear more about today, or you would like to understand a little bit better. So I'll give you another 30 seconds or so to make your choices, maybe a minute, because it's an answer, a longer answer at the end there. Great. Thank you for answering it. Camille, if you want to end the poll, and then maybe we can see it on our screen. So most of you are, oops, it just kind of went away. Do you want to share it again, Camille?
Yes, let me see. Did that work?
I don't.
Nope. Here, let's see. Maybe if I go.
Oh, Josh can see it. Okay, maybe I can't see it because I'm screen share. There we go. So,
Okay.
most of you are in the not familiar at all or somewhat familiar. We have one expert in the room. That's great. Some of you are moderately familiar. And I'm sorry, I misspelled that there. And then I will share in the chat later on when I switch over to Camille to slide share what you all had said about what you would like to understand better because I cannot see that here, and I'll share that in the chat. So with that, I will now turn it over to our friends and experts from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Lisa Schwartz and Natalie Mims-Frick. There are institutions in the distribution planning space, and we'll kind of set the scene and give us a great overview on distribution planning fundamentals. And as Lisa will start talking, I will stop sharing and have Camille share the slides.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. And it's great to be with you all here today. I will go first and give you sort of a broader outline and cover some best practices in certain topics. And then Natalie will swoop in near the bottom of the hour and cover a couple specific topics that I think you all will be very interested in. Let's move to slide 3. So I always show this slide. I have been ringing this bell for a very long time, like before the year in the graph. Costs are going up on the distribution side, and they have been not had the focus of, cost for power plants and transmission that I've always thought they should have. And so the day has finally come. Affordability is on everyone's radar, just as a renter or homeowner, all the way up to a business and, like academics, at my institution. So this is really why states, specifically state energy offices and public utility commissions as well, and consumer advocates are increasingly interested in this topic. I think the numbers say it all. Here is the latest chart from Edison Electric Institute. Keep in mind, this is only showing capital expenditures. It's not showing expenses. So these are just like the investments where the utility has an opportunity to earn a return on investment because it's like an asset, right? So not even including expenses, just capital expenditures and just by investor utilities over time. So distribution system investments account for the largest part of CapEx, about a third, and the estimated cost for 2025 is $66 billion in the US. Next slide, please. And it's not just the investor and utilities. Distribution costs really dominate across all kinds of electric utilities, including municipal utilities and rural electric co-ops. In fact, distribution capital costs were the main driver of electricity spending increases over the last 2 decades. Next slide. So utilities conduct planning at all levels of the electricity system, from distribution to the bulk power system, which includes generation and transmission, as well as at the customer end. They plan for energy efficiency programs, distributed generation programs, storage, demand flexibility. So every utility conducts distribution system planning in the country to assess the physical and operational changes that are needed to continue safe and reliable service. But they'll only share that information typically when required to do so. So the top map here shows our data visualization that's available with the states and territories that require regulated utilities to file some kind of distribution plan. And that number has really grown steadily over the past decade. Moving clockwise, the map at the bottom right shows that most states require electric regulated utilities to file some type of long-term plan for the bulk power system. And this is curious to me because this is even true in restructured states. They're not as fulsome. I think it's an understatement. But there's usually some kind of filing. And some states are looking at this right now because they realize they're not getting the information they used to. And then finally, the last map here shows about 15 states that require some kind a grid resilience plan. And these are typically focused on one specific hazard like storms or wildfire, rather than being comprehensive, although some are. Point I'd like to make here is that these planning processes are typically siloed. I don't think that's a great thing. I think greater coordination, integration across these plans can improve economic efficiency and address all of the changes in growing complexity at the grid edge, at the consumer side. Next slide. So I'm going to focus here on distribution system plans, and the kind that are required to be filed across the country really vary, and the kind that, utilities are focused on vary. So some states have enacted laws that give the utility an opportunity for expedited cost recovery for some kinds of distribution system improvements. So as part of the deal, they have to file a plan and have some transparency for the regulator and stakeholders. Some states require grid modernization plans that provide a technology roadmap for the capital investments and other expenditures, the expenses like, vegetation management, for example. So that kind of plan is informed by the distribution plan, and ideally they're filed together. You might have separate laws, but like in Minnesota, for example, they're filed together because the regulator decided that's a really good idea. Some utilities are filing these voluntarily because they are finding some value with having stakeholders engage in this topic up front, and maybe they'll garner more support at the time where they're trying to recover costs. In a few states, because of state policies and objectives, the regulated utilities are filing specific plans for distributed energy resources to consider ways to better deploy and integrate customer resources. And more states are requiring what I'll call integrated distribution plans. So these really take that systematic and objectives-based approach to long-term investment strategies, and where relevant and ideally are coordinated with bulk power system plans. We've got a paper coming up soon on that. Next slide. So a little bit more about integrated distribution planning. You're always starting with what are your long-term high-level outcomes that you're trying to achieve. That's what should determine the grid capabilities are needed. And those capabilities that you want in turn establish what functions and system requirements you're going after. So we've always had the traditional aims for electricity systems, safe and reliable service, reasonable costs, but we have a whole bunch of newer aims. And you all are well aware. How do we plan for large new loads, whether they're fleet charging or large public charging stations, or data centers or expansion of existing data centers? Some are on the distribution side or sub-transmission. Enhancing resilience to all kinds of new threats, improving the utilization of assets that you already have so that you're not just using them like a few hours a year. How do you fix that? Accelerated deployment of new technologies and grid services, and then better integrating all of the resources that customers may have on site. So it's important that this is a transparent, objective-based process that's informed by stakeholders. Next slide. So this is an old slide of mine because it hasn't really changed. Anytime you're talking about a planning process, what are your hopes and dreams? How do you, so first and foremost, it's the better oversight of all of the capital expenditures as well as operation and maintenance expenses for the distribution system. And when utilities actually file or share, their distribution system plans, they make transparent the planned investments in a more holistic way before they are showing up individually in your rates. So you have a better picture of the total costs. There should be, meaningful opportunities for engagement with stakeholders and if it's regulated utilities, regulators to improve outcomes. And, by regulator, I'm including the boards of municipal and cooperative utilities, not just, PUCs for regulated investor-owned utilities. Like all other kinds of planning, we don't know the future. So you've got to consider uncertainties under a range of possible futures or scenarios. Consider all solutions, including customer resources for least cost and the risk that costs may not be what you think they are. And enable consumers and third-party service providers to propose solutions and participate in providing grid services. Next slide. So when you've gone through this process, how do you know it worked? First, you should see stakeholder input reflected in the plans, even if the utility didn't agree. At least it's nice to have, say, an appendix where it's noted. That's sort of the ideal, and it should include any action that the utility took as a result. And second, you see that the utility considered alternative solutions to meet grid needs and really good analysis, robust and transparent analysis. And you're including both the traditional distribution investments, the poles and wires, grid mod technologies, and non-wires solutions like storage and demand flexibility, among others. And you should see a clear roadmap over time for utility actions designed to achieve state objectives with utility priorities and timelines. You'll see a well-organized and documented filing that specifies how it meets state requirements, if any, explains how this plan is coordinated with other plans, including state energy plans, and provides useful information for regulators and stakeholders. There should be an opportunity where the regulators, whether it's the boards of public utilities or the Public Utility Commission, is providing feedback on the filed plan. Most of these plans that are required to be filed are not approved. All the prudent stuff is saved for rate cases, but what's the point of filing the plan if you're not getting any feedback? So I think that's super important. And hopefully this planning process actually facilitates cost recovery of prudent utility expenditures. The utilities cost recovery requests are clearly tied to the state objectives and priorities. You could really see that in the plan. And finally, and this doesn't happen that much, utilities are tracking and reporting on their progress for implementing plans. Even if it's in the next distribution system plan, they say, like, here's what we said we were going to do, here's where we're at, here's why things changed. Next slide. So state energy office engagement can take many forms. Next slide. So we published a report, Berkeley Lab, with NASEO a couple of years ago on exactly this topic. And I've had some sort of different words and updates here, but basically along the same lines. So state energy offices conduct so many different kinds of analyses that could inform distribution plans. For example, with respect to technologies, state energy offices are running programs. They could be, grant, rebate, tax credit programs, all kinds of things where they're doing studies. The legislature might have required a study. This might come as a result of stakeholder engagement in state planning or from the governor's office. So you're conducting studies all the time. So for technologies, maybe you're looking at technical potential or cost effectiveness or barriers and opportunities. So one recent example is Massachusetts grid services study. How could customer resources provide grid services that are valuable and maybe less expensive than some utility solutions? In Georgia Tech, they've got grid interactive efficient building technologies of all kinds that they're testing out and studying. State of the grid analyses, New Mexico State Energy Office has conducted reports both on a baseline of electricity systems in the state and more recently a grid modernization assessment. New York explicitly conducted a study with respect to distribution systems looking at impacts from electrification of transportation. All kinds of state level forecasts and scenarios that you might be looking at could inform distribution planning. The sort of major example is California, where they do state level forecasts and scenarios that the utilities have to use. But that's sort of one end of the spectrum. There are all kinds of spectrums here. You might be working with a state university that has really good information you could contribute to a distribution planning work group. The state energy strategy that you're all updating all the time, you could better consider distribution level investments. And I think Kentucky's is short and sweet, but it's a nice example of consideration of the distribution system and its role in all kinds of things that the state cares about. Convening is such a perfect thing for state energy offices. If you're not, the regulator, then you can convene stakeholders to sort of work on, a specific topic and make recommendations and make progress. So lots of examples here from lots of different states, different ways to do this. Next slide. Incorporating distribution planning more explicitly in your various state plans is another way that you can sort of advance thinking in your state. So you can make recommendations in your state energy plans with respect to distribution investments. Your energy security plans could highlight resilience risks, as they do for the distribution system, but maybe provide more insight into potential investments and programs utilities could undertake that really align best with state priorities. And ideally, the utilities are taking the information in your plans and putting it, into their resilience plans as relevant, and ideally all together as part of a distribution system plan. That's sort of the dream. You've got some siting responsibilities probably, or you might be able to contribute to a study. But, think about like storage siting issues. That's an area the states could work on. If your state energy office hosts the siting board, as mine in Oregon does, then all kinds of things that you could be looking at the distribution level for siting processes to advance grid modernization technologies and maybe get infrastructure in place more quickly. You administer a ton of programs, from rebates to tax credits to loan programs to, divvying up federal funding. And a lot of these involve distribution infrastructure. So you're already doing a lot of this. Certainly, you can make recommendations on draft utility distribution plans. Draft plans are, filed before a formal proceeding. And that's the case in some states. So, for example, the Massachusetts Office of Energy Resources reviews the draft electric sector modernization plans and provides recommendations on them. And then the utility has the opportunity, and it's an advisory group process that involves a lot of different players. And then the plans that are filed at the regulator can be improved from the get-go. And finally, depending on your state energy office, there's a lot of differently positioned state energy offices. You may consider participating in regulatory proceedings in areas of expertise. I list a bunch of areas here. And it could be just as part of a work group. It doesn't have to be that you're filing, testimony. And usually the distribution planning processes are informal processes. There's not even really testimony, it's just comments. Next slide. All right, so I'm just going to highlight an interactive decision framework funded by U.S. Department of Energy that walks through this stakeholder-informed process for distribution planning. Next slide. And you can scan the QR code and take a look at this as I go through this quickly, but everything flows from the top, the state and local goals and planning objectives. In the blue boxes, you've got a host of technical analyses, the really locational nitty-gritty forecasts that you need for distribution planning, for loads and distributed resources, and scenario analyses that consider different plausible alternative futures with respect to those forecasts. Assessments of the current state of the distribution system are like a baseline with respect to reliability and resilience. You look at both near and long-term distribution needs, and there are lots of other analyses like hosting capacity for solar and EV charging. The gray box represents sourcing a subset of solutions that meet suitability criteria from customer-side resources through pricing, like time-varying pricing programs that may already be in play, but you're sort of targeting the funding, and procurements like the request for proposals for specific grid need, specific operational requirements. Natalie will talk a little bit more about that later. And then the green circle at the bottom is sort of the resulting plans. And at the left, you can see the connections with the system-wide forecasts, not just at the distribution level, but across the whole system, and the bulk power system planning connections. Next slide. So each step of the framework describes what happens at a particular place in the process, why it's important, different roles and responsibilities for stakeholders, and current and emerging best practices. And there are also flow charts, a list of tools with links that are available today, and an annotated list of resources for more information. Next slide. So each of the topics in the framework, here are all the topics that are listed. I mean, there are more topics for distribution planning, but these are the ones that we targeted for this particular tool. One topic of particular interest, of course, is cost effectiveness investments. And there's a link on the slide to a recent Berkeley Lab report that helps think through the process. Depending on the objectives and priorities, the sort of utility circumstances and especially the drivers. Is it a requirement, through a standard, or is this something else? Next slide. So I don't have a lot of time, so at a very high level, I'm going to share some leading practices for distribution planning. I'm only going to cover some of the areas. Next slide. And there's going to be a lot more text than I'm going to have time to cover. So this will be a resource that you can look back on. So first, like, how often are these things filed and what is the planning horizon? So internally, the utilities are conducting planning every year for distribution systems, and they're updating their solutions and cost estimates every 2 years. But there's also a long-term capital plan. Substations might take 6 years to build, for example. So the best practice is really to look at a 10-year period for that long-term plan. In states where utilities are actually required to file plans, the best practice is filing every 2 to 3 years because it's a lot of work for everyone. And that seems to be about the right frequency. Next slide. So forecasting is really foundational to planning. And for distribution planning, the main point here is that you're talking about peak demand at specific locations on the system. And that informs everything, the timing, the need, and the type of distribution and system investment. And there's lots of best practices for reporting data that is relevant to load forecasts, including the inputs and assumptions for modeling and estimates of peak demand for substations and feeders. Next slide. And since no one can perfectly predict the future, utilities can use scenario analysis to assess the potential impact of plausible future conditions. And scenario analysis has been done for decades for integrated resource planning for the bulk power system. And it's pretty nascent for distribution planning. I'm not really sure why, but we're getting there. So this is an area that maybe state energy offices could highlight as something, and maybe, provide some recommendations for scenarios based on your information and expertise. So this is all really about testing the robustness of the plan. What are some least regrets investments, potential flexibility that you might need to sort of shift around uncertainties. Next slide. This is something that's very common across the country. This is reporting on worst performing circuits. So even if utilities are not filing a distribution plan, they are probably, the regulated utilities, are in front of the commissions, and hopefully also in front of the boards of public utilities and co-ops, reporting on the worst performing circuits, feeders. And you're looking at the duration of the outage, the frequency of outages, the number of customer service interruptions, and you want to focus your attention on these worst sort of circuits. And you have some historical look. It's not just 1 year. And then ultimately you're looking at the metrics, performance history, and remediation plans. Next slide. This is super important for distribution planning, taking a look at your assets, and you have a program for, considering replacement of aging facility. This is all about the physical infrastructure to maintain safety and reliability. So utilities establish an inventory of their assets and they systematically analyze their condition. They have we're going to check this every so often. And they've got standards and requirements. So they can report on the criteria for assessing the condition of their assets. They can provide the data that demonstrate the need for new programmatic investments, because this can eat up a lot of money. And what's the potential impact? It's not just about spending money. What are you going to get for your dollar? And then how did they select the equipment? Next slide. So ultimately, they come up with a grid needs assessment. So this is sort of like an output of the process. And it identifies specific deficiencies over the planning period. It includes description of each deficiency, the engineering characteristics, the timing of the need, and all of this informs the utility's investment strategy. And this includes both traditional poles and wires and alternatives. Leading practices include, it's really about sharing data that describe the deficiency and enable identification of potential cost-effective solutions. Next slide. Natalie's going to talk about this one a little bit more, but geo-targeted programs are a low-cost way to meet a subset of distribution system needs, including capacity. So if you're already spending money on energy efficiency programs or demand flexibility programs, storage, you might consider recommending that some of that money be sort of targeted to kind of not just reduce energy needs, but also to reduce spending on distribution system. And that's what this is all about. The interesting thing here, and this may seem a little counterintuitive, but the highest value opportunities are where low load growth is driving the utility toward a large capital investment because there's a significant value for peak load relief for each kilowatt because there's not a lot of revenue flowing through those specific circuits or substations. So that's something important to know. Next slide. Non-wires alternatives are the services that certain kinds of customer programs, customer resources can provide at specific locations that can reduce, defer, or avoid altogether a needed upgrade. And best practices include very clear suitability criteria for eligible solutions, lots of documentation on methods and assumptions for screening projects that customers and third-party providers propose, and using a technology agnostic approach. Now, could be storage, could be energy efficiency, could be fuel cells, it could be a combination of tons of things. Next slide. So I've included a couple of slides here that you can look at on your own. These are questions that states can ask and actions that states can take, which is the next slide, to advance distribution planning practices. And I've got a slew of resources, next slide, that can help you get started or further advance practices in your state. Next slide. So first and foremost, state energy offices can request technical assistance on distribution and transmission planning and many other topics. The first two types of technical assistance listed here, the sort of quick help and the expert match, you can get up to 100 hours of help available at no cost to the state. Pretty easy process, and you can see the link here. And periodically, there's sort of deeper dive opportunities, and Kirsten, folks at NASEO will let you know about that. Next slide. I have several resources that I highlight on the next several slides. Because of time, I'm going to leave it there and let you look at that on your own. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. And we'll go straight into Natalie's presentation, continuing sort of on the fundamentals. And you can just share the slides, Camille. There should be continuing. And I've seen already one question in the chat, which we'll get to at the end. And then if you have further questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or we can have you all ask them live during the Q&A. That over to Natalie and Camille. I don't think we see your screen right now. So if you want to share those slides, perfect.
Thank you. Excuse me. So today I'm going to talk about load growth we can go on to the next slide, load growth from buildings, which sometimes electrification is one of the reasons that load growth occurs in buildings, and distribution system planning. And then I will talk about stakeholder engagement after that. So we can go on to the next slide. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on load growth from buildings and the distribution system, and then I will talk about some challenges and some strategies to overcome it, as well as efficiency and demand flexibility programs that can be used to help manage load growth from buildings. So as background, when buildings switch from natural gas heating to electric heating, it can have an impact on electricity consumption, and it can often cause load growth in the electricity sector. And most natural gas consumption, which is shown on blue in these charts, is in residential and commercial building heating. And so when people are switching from gas heating to electric heating, it can have impacts on the distribution system. Next slide, please. There's lots of states and regions that have different quantities or a different mix of electric and non-electric energy consumption. And load growth is going to affect these regions differently. States on the left side of this slide use more delivered fuels in their energy consumption, and states on the right use more electricity. But regardless of where your state falls in this, there can be impacts from load growth from buildings in your state, because even if you have lots of heat pumps, for example, already, replacing them with more efficient heat pumps could actually cause a decline in your consumption for heating. And understanding what is causing your load growth is important on your distribution system. We can go to the next slide. So the impacts of load growth on the distribution system from buildings it's not going to be uniform. It's going to depend on the breakdown within your state. So this chart on the left is from Massachusetts. It shows the orange counties are those that have um, electric heat, or it's a higher quantity of households that have electric heat. And on the blue, there's less electric heat. So obviously all of those areas that are blue, if they're using delivered fuels, natural gas for heating, and they switch to electricity for heating, they're going to experience load growth on their distribution system in a different way than what the orange counties are going to. And then also, just stepping back and thinking about distribution system planning and thinking about load growth and how it needs to be addressed, understanding what the mix of different types of load growth that can occur from moving from different types of fuels will be important. And this is just on the right side of the slide, a mix of different types of um, um, industrial uses and commercial uses from an IRP as an example. We can go on to the next slide. Two big challenges that need to be addressed in distribution system planning when thinking about load growth from buildings is understanding the impact of weather and the adoption rate. So changing weather patterns can be really hard to plan for, and that's something that everyone is trying to address with load forecasting and resource adequacy. In particular, heat pumps, which are often the technology that's used when you're switching from one fuel to another, um, operate differently in extreme cold. And so understanding how your heat pump load shape might change as your adoption rate of that technology shows up on your distribution system can be quite important. And also the longer that the events happen, such as some of our more severe winter storms that we've seen recently, can stress the equipment in ways that may not show up in historical load forecasts. And then adoption rate, it's going to cause pockets of growth, similar to that last picture I showed of Massachusetts, depending on where your fuels are and what kind of decisions are being made about how building load growth is occurring is going to impact your distribution system differently. So some areas may experience growth while other areas do not. We can go on to the next slide. So I'll talk quickly about some of the strategies. I'm not going to go over all of these for what the solutions are, but a big one is improving load forecasting. One of the ways that can happen is from expanding the forecast horizon, so looking at a longer period of time than um, 1 to 5 years to better understand how much extreme weather has been included in your load forecast, as well as understanding if assumptions about energy consumption have been, particularly for heating, dependent on that weather. And so if you've had a bunch of mild weather years, you may not see that impact of building load growth from switching your heating sources until there's more extreme weather. And so while your adoption rate may be increasing, you also may be having mild weather years. And so that can all become compounded. And so looking at a longer forecast can be useful for that. Also broadening the factors that are considered in your load forecasting and looking beyond just what your historical trends are, but using different types of modeling to understand how your different demand is going to change in the characteristics of your building. So understanding what your building stock is and how different technology adoptions are going to impact that. Um, Understanding your building baseline is also important. Where are you starting from? What might happen as load growth in buildings occurs? Considering the impacts of weather, I mentioned that one already, but really understanding the impacts, particularly for heating changes, of that relationship between changes in weather and your heating energy consumption. And then finally, looking at multiple forecasts, so doing scenario analysis, understanding different um, technology assumptions, location, and just considering different options besides just one path forward in your load forecasts. The second strategy that can be used to help improve load forecasts or the second strategy that can help improve the understanding the impacts of load growth from buildings on distribution system planning is to modernize your planning approach. And that's really around considering your core planning assumptions. So thinking about how much loading your feeder can have, and then how much you're comfortable with, what your planning margin assumptions are, and also what your assumptions around your load diversity are. So are you assuming that if you have, an understanding of your building stock, that all of the heating technology is turning on at exactly the same time, and understanding that that's not likely how things will happen. There'll be a staggered and varied approach across all of your different buildings that you're planning for. You can go, a couple more. You can go beyond just looking at a single peak hour. So gaining a better understanding of what the distribution system impacts are beyond like one critical hour of the year. And it doesn't have to be an 8760 hourly annual perspective, but considering representative or extreme days in your planning can be helpful as well. And then also considering how to improve your reliability and resilience metrics, and understanding if those are the correct metrics you want to be used for measuring risk. And if there's other metrics you may want to be considering, particularly if heating is one of the areas where electricity is causing load growth in your buildings, and understanding of the impacts and risk to human health could be something that you may also want to include. And then my last point is on information sharing between your natural gas and electric utilities as load growth in buildings occur. Having relationships, conversations occurring between what is happening on the natural gas side of the system and what is happening on the electricity system can be really important. Trying to start conversations to align inputs for forecasting and planning, which ultimately can result in more robust portfolio analysis and potentially lower costs as well. So we can go on to the next slide. We can talk about some strategies for reducing the impact of building load growth on the distribution system. We can go to the next slide. I'll talk about a couple of efficiency and demand flexibility options. The first one is promoting efficient load growth. So this is an example of electrification in Fort Collins from an analysis that we did. And we looked at the summer and winter peak impact from different levels of electrification with different packages of technologies. And the blue line is the less efficient load growth. The green line is no load growth. Blue line is less efficient. The orange line is efficient electrification, so higher efficiency heat pumps, etc. And as you can see, it not only pushes the peak out in the summertime, but also pushes it down both in the summer and the winter. Go on to the next slide. You can encourage utilities to plan and create energy efficiency programs that reduce peak demand. So efficiency that occurs during high cost hours when the grid is constrained, can reduce your peak demand. And so targeting programs at what consumption is happening in your buildings during those periods can be a really cost-effective way of bringing down costs, not just for customers that are installing those efficient technologies, but also everyone on the system. And this is a graphic from some analysis that we did on residential and commercial programs that can produce peak demand savings efficiency programs. And we found from the utility measurement and verification reports that the majority of the programs are reducing peak demand for less than $200 a kW. So it can be really cost effective. We can go on to the next slide. This is what Lisa had mentioned earlier, the geo-targeted programs. So you can implement a non-wires type program. And this was done as an alternative to a capacity upgrade. And it was a $4.1 million capacity upgrade on the distribution system. And the pilot ran for 1 year. And what the bar charts on the slide show is that the efficiency measures and load control programs that were used created peak demand savings, and it enabled them to defer the investment. And so this is another opportunity to consider when you're going through your distribution system plans as a way to defer or potentially eliminate the need to spend for additional infrastructure. We can go on to the next slide. States can also encourage utilities to promote demand flexibility. This is some examples from a report we did where we talked about trends in demand flexibility program incentive structures and the incentive levels that were being offered. And so there's a pretty significant amount of research around thermostats and batteries and what kind of incentives you could use and what kind of results you could see for those types of programs. We can go on to the next slide. States can also consider innovative approaches to demand flexibility. So this example, Portland General Electric explored what motivated their customers to participate in their demand flexibility programs. And they found that bill savings is a big motivator, but there was also reliability and resilience and community social responsibility aspects too. So coming up with targeted messages for the appropriate customers and making sure you're reaching out to people to meet them where they're at and help them understand what their energy goals or meet their own energy goals. We can go on to the next slide. You can also consider front of the meter efficiency programs to help mitigate load growth impacts. Conservation voltage reduction is a popular program and allows for operation of the transmission or distribution system to provide voltage on the lower end of the acceptable range. And that can achieve efficiency and energy and demand savings. And an example that I have on here is from Illinois, where Ameren, they had a measurement and verification report, and they found that their conservation voltage reduction program saved almost 87 gigawatt hours and more than 13 megawatts of peak demand. So really significant savings coming from this type of program and very cost effectively. We can go on to the next slide. My next topic is around stakeholder engagement. I'm going to skip over some of my slides so that we have time for questions, but stakeholder engagement is really about outreach to try and produce the most robust results that you can. And stakeholder engagement typically occurs in most regulatory proceedings and has a lot of different parties involved. We can go on to the next slide. There's lots of different organizations that participate in distribution system planning. This is just a snapshot of some of them. It including state energy officials and consumer advocates, lots of community organizations, also resource providers, so a variety of different perspectives, and large customers as well. We can go on to the next slide. The main reason, as I mentioned, that stakeholder engagement is really valuable in distribution system planning is because this is the point where people really see the grid as the distribution system. This is what's connecting them. They look out in their neighborhood and they're going to see the distribution system. It's often where community energy goals are going to be discussed and resolved as well, whether it's, access to a preferred energy source or reliability or resilience. Those are going to come up in distribution system planning. And it really can enable a more robust conversation and a more durable outcome that is has positive impacts for everyone that's participating. We can go on to the next slide. There's 13 different states that have explicit distribution system planning requirements. And these are the states listed here, and it's links to their distribution system planning stakeholder engagement requirements. The majority of them have requirements that that the utility engage with stakeholders prior to filing their distribution system plan. We can go on to the next slide. Some of the common requirements that we see in stakeholder engagement requirements for distribution system plans are specifying a minimum number of meetings that the utility has to hold prior to filing the plan, requiring that certain topics be discussed. And this could be something that changes over time as well. In your first distribution system plan, you may want topics that are focused on one thing to be where you target, and you could change it for the next cycle in 1 or 3 or 5 years. The other one is around working groups, requirement that working groups be established, and also holding workshops is another requirement, setting a number of workshops or topics that have to be covered at those workshops. We can go on to the next slide. So distribution system plans are often requiring stakeholder engagement to ensure transparency and participation. They typically are really emphasizing sharing information and two-way communication. So information flowing not just from the utility to the stakeholders, but also from the stakeholders back to the utility. And in some cases, seeing that feedback show up in the plan or requirement, the utility, acknowledge that feedback and discuss how they have addressed it in their distribution system plan. And there's formal and informal approaches. As I said, some of the distribution system planning requirements require established workshops or meetings that are held or a specific schedule be met. And there's also informal engagements that can happen as well as, town hall meetings or webinars. So many different forms of engagement can occur. We can go on to the next slide. This is a few different stages of when stakeholder engagement occurs. As I said in one of the earlier slides, a lot of it is prior to the distribution system plan being filed. One example of that is I have New York on this slide, but Illinois also is another example. They have their integrated grid plan requirements, and they have pretty prescriptive requirements around the number of workshops that are held, and also that there's an independent facilitator, and that the facilitator files their report documenting the stakeholder engagement with the commission. It can also occur after the distribution system plan is filed. And it can also occur in future distribution system plans. And so the future distribution system plans as states are going through multiple cycles of distribution system planning, we're seeing them refine the stakeholder engagement requirements, either to say that some kind of stakeholder engagement needs to happen prior to the next proceeding that's addressing an issue that was brought up but wasn't able to be discussed in the proceeding that they're ruling on. So that's one example. Also requirements that there be different types of engagement in future distribution system plan proceedings. We can go on to the next slide. There's also requirements that PUCs report on their stakeholder engagement. So similar to what I said earlier about Illinois and the facilitator for their stakeholder engagement filing that plan with the commission, there's also several other states that have requirements that the utility acknowledge and respond to stakeholder feedback. And there's a range of how that may show up. For example, in Rhode Island, there's least cost procurement plans, and the utilities have to include minutes of the public meetings and presentations that are made from energy efficiency council meetings in their least cost procurement plans. Oregon is a little bit on the further side of the spectrum of requirements, and they have community engagement plans that they require. And so this is in addition to the distribution system plan. The utilities have to consider how they'll be engaging with communities on topics that are affecting them. And then I think I may have one more slide, but that might be okay. So the last thing is that for stakeholder engagement for when the distribution system plan is completed, there's also some requirements from states that allow the commission staff or other state entities to hold meetings after the plan has been filed to hear additional feedback, to better understand what could change moving forward. There's also some requirements that go from planning to procurement and bring stakeholder engagement along that process as well. For example, in California, they require the non-wires alternative analysis that occurs in the distribution system plan to be informed and advised from a stakeholder group that is then working on the non-wires alternative analysis procurement. So I will stop there so that we have just a little bit of time for questions. I know that was fast and furious, but Lisa and I are always available for additional conversations about any of these topics.